Hey, I'm excited about this last question because it wasn't one that I was asked in class today. 20, it's about question 22. It says, I had put D, which was wrong, and apparently I have no idea how to do this problem correctly. So, how do you do it? Let's take a look at question 22. It's kind of verbose. There's a lot of setup to it. There's two things, right? There's a bit of client code and there's an object. There's a class. The class is called it's an int object, and basically its whole purpose in life is just to store a single integer. There's two constructors. The default constructor takes no parameters and it sets up an int object that's storing 0. The other one takes a single integer parameter and it stores that into the myInt value. By the way, notice that value is private, right? You can't access that directly. And then the other one here is this one called increment. Increment doesn't return anything, but you can see what it does. It does increase the value of myInt by 1. So now let's take a look at the small bit of client code that's working with that class. And there's two things here. Down here we've got the big main method. That's what we're going to look at. But there's this little helper method here called int object. No, it's not called that. It returns an int object. It's called some method. And you can see some method requires that an integer object be passed to it. And it also requires that it returns an integer object. So it takes an int object and it returns an int object. So in Java, of course, everything is passed by value. That means when I send something to a method, I'm sending the actual thing. Now, the thing that I'm actually sending here is called an object reference, right? I'm sending it the variable, but it's an object reference variable. So when I call this code, what am I doing? Well, I'm creating a local variable called obj that is going to point at the very thing that I was just handed, right? And you can see in this first line of code, int object ans equals obj. So here's this object. I have no idea what the integer object is or everything that it does. I know one thing that it does, right? But here it is. And obj is a reference to that. That's passed by parameter. I actually receive that from the passed by value. I receive that from the outside world. And then it sets up immediately this other reference variable that's capable of pointing at integer objects. It's called ans. And ans is a reference variable that's pointing to the exact same object. So now obj and ans are both pointing to the same thing inside of this method. The next thing that happens is this method asks ans to increment itself. So all of a sudden, let's say that ans was the number 3. What this does is it comes along and says, no, it's not 3 anymore, right? We're now going to increment this as this is now 4. So both of them, both obj and ans, are pointing at the same exact object, and it now has the value 4 in it. And then finally it says return ans. So whatever this reference variable is, it's going to get returned back to where it started. Okay, so now let's see if we can piece this together because there's all kinds of fun things happening below here. So first line, int object x is a new integer object. Okay, so here's this x. X is a reference variable that points at an integer object that contains the value 2 and other things too, but I'm just going to put the 2 there. And I'll just show that it's a reference variable pointing at that. Y is another integer object reference variable, and it's pointing at this integer object that's storing the value 7, right? It's a new one created with 7. The very next line of code says, hey, let's make a third one. So they make a third one, they're calling it A. But this one they're not setting up as a new integer object. They're saying, hey, A, you are going to point to the exact same object that Y is. So that's right, they're aliases of each other. A and Y are now pointing to the same things. Next line of code, it says X equals some method. Okay, first of all, when some method is done, it's going to return something. And whatever it returns, X is going to be pointing to that thing at that point. So some method Y is going to return an int object. X will be pointing at that at the end. So this is going to change what X is pointing to. So let's see if we can figure out what that does. So let's come back over here and let's change this number now to the number 2. No. Actually, no. We're sending it the one with the y. So what's really happening here, and if I wanted to show this really accurate, let me get rid of this altogether. As soon as I jump in here, because I'm passing this reference variable y to it, object obj is pointing to the same thing. So at this point, I have the y, the a, and object up here in this method, right, that are all pointing to the same object that contains the number 7. Inside of here, I then go a step further and I say, hey, ANS is a new integer object that's equal to object. So ANS is now pointing to this as well. Now I come along and I say, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to increment that value. Okay, if you say so. So right now it's a 7 in there, but I'm going to call increment via this reference, right? This reference is the one that I'm using. Not that it matters, but just so you can see it's ans.increment. They're all pointing at the same one. So what's going to happen is this 7 is no longer going to be 7. It's going to increment, and now it's the number 8. It's a great diagram of what's happening. Okay, that's done. And look very closely what happens. It now says return ANS. So this very thing, this reference variable, is going to be returned. And what's happening now is x is going to be that reference variable. So all of a sudden, x, this right here, is no longer called, well, x. What's happening is this ANS that's getting returned is now going to be called the reference variable x. Right? So x is that reference variable that was returned. Well, okay, you can see there's a problem here. X just got reassigned. X is no longer what it was. X is now a reference variable that's pointing to this value 8. The very next thing that happens here is A is going to get messed up somehow. A is going to get passed a value. A is going to become the same some reference variable after I call some method with x. So if I call some method with x, look at what happens. First thing that happens is object points to that thing. So now object is pointing to here. Oh, by the way, when that method did end, when that some method ends, this variable does cease to exist, right? Once this bit of code from here to here is done, that first object variable is gone. So that is gone. I should have erased that. I'm sorry. And the only reason why x persisted was because we told x it should be some method, the thing that it sent back. Okay, so what happens now? Driving me crazy, my head's spinning. What happens now is I'm going to take and object obj is going to become a new object reference. It's going to be local to the method, and it's going to point to the same thing that it was handed. It's going to be pointing to the same thing x is, which is that one. And then it says, okay, create this new one called ANS. Got it. This new reference variable ANS is capable of pointing at integer objects, and we want you to point to the same thing that object is pointing to. Okay, if you say so. Next, please use ANS as reference, and we want you to increment that. So this little 8 in here, it's very popular, by the way. If only most variables wish they had just at least one reference variable. This thing's got so many things pointing at it, it's going crazy. It becomes a 9. And then the very next thing that happens, right, is this method is terminating. As this method terminates, object, this pointer dies. This pointer is going to die also, right? But what's going to happen to it is it's going to, it's actually the one that's put right here, right? So now all of a sudden A is going to become the variable that points to that. It just, and you know, it didn't change, but it's that. So at this point, if you look, and it says, what are the object values of x, y, and a respectively? Well, as it turns out, they're all pointing at the 9. So the answer here is A. Magic of magic, they're all pointing at 9, 9, 9, and 9. I have no idea if this is helpful. Maybe you should, I don't know. Talk to me in the morning, and have a great evening.